My name's Olivia Guntarik, and I work in the School of Media and Communication at RMIT. And welcome everyone for our third day of the Activism at the Margins conference. It's been an exciting 2 days. I've got someone really important I'm about to introduce you to, an Emeritus, that'll do, Professor Tony Dalton, who I have known for the last 10 years. When I first started at RMIT, I saw Tony from a distance and I thought to myself, he is a resistance fighter. Don't know, there was just something about his look. I thought he just had this consciousness about him, moral consciousness, and he stood out. He stood out, well, because of his height, and he's really tall, white man. But at the same time, there was something about the way that he worked, the way that he dealt with particular situations, the way that he has supported my work over the years and has also mentored me. So I feel that these moments are really important in your life when you're not certain about who you are and what your role is. And at the time, I was this kind of newly minted PhD graduate, and I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. It was my first job in a university. So I guess part of this talk that Tony will give is about his own development, political consciousness. Because at the age of 18 or 19, he made this really important decision. He made a decision not to go to war, to the Vietnam War. And that, to me, as someone who wasn't even born at that time when the Vietnam War was taking place, when I see all these words like conscientious objector, draft resistor, non-violent action, I kind of wonder, what the hell are all these words? What do these words mean? Because to me, they strike me as quite different. You know, these words you have been introduced into my lexicon over the years. I've got a fairly good understanding now of what they mean. But when I was much younger, in the 70s, when I was learning to speak English, I had no idea what these words meant. But over time, I started to realise, and as my own political consciousness grew, that people who take action when it's important can actually make a difference. And so I guess part of this talk is also about memories, history. Memories because when I invited Tony to come and speak at this event, I wanted him to speak because I had this image. I was listening to the radio in my car one day and I heard Tony's voice on the radio. And I can't remember exactly what he was saying, but he was describing himself on a bus. And I thought, Tony's wearing a wig? It's like he's describing himself wearing this really long wig. It was in the 70s. And the reason why he was wearing this wig was because he had to go into hiding because the police were after him. Okay, these are just kind of little snippets of stories. I don't know whether you're going to talk about that, Tony. Other memories. So Tony went to the State Library last week to find some photographs because his father, who was part of the Communist Party, how exciting, looked for, during the time of when Tony was a protester, during the 60s and 70s, late 60s and 70s, early 70s, his father decided he was going to collect all these images from the newspaper. And he archived them. Now, I also went to the library trying to look for those photographs, and I just got a manila folder. And Tony just told me that he went there and searched the archives and he found 2 boxes. And I asked him, how did that happen? Did you have a secret password or something? Because these 2 boxes contained these really significant images, and you'll get to see those too. So I'm just giving you some little teasers of what this talk is going to be about today. Anything else I should say?
I think
that's
that's
He's being very modest. So please welcome Tony Dalton.
Thank you, Olivia, for those kind words, and I've certainly enjoyed working with Olivia over those last 10 or so years. It's been terrific. Okay, so just a little definition here, and as I started to focus in on this word activism and look around, it actually shows me that the word gets picked up and gets used in a whole lot of ways. You might, for instance, hear from time to time this idea of judicial activism, in a sense, courts that where people are active on the bench, in a sense, redefining laws and redefining social and economic relations as a part of that. And the other thing I would come back to, and I want to say a little bit about this here at the end, is the importance of thinking about the concept of the state. I don't mean just the state government, I mean the whole system of governance that we have in this country, and indeed we have across all nation states, and of course they're all quite different, which means that, you know, when we're in different situations, that we work quite differently. So yes, I have my period of activism around the period of the Vietnam War and conscription, which had a very definite style and a set of objectives, which I need to talk about. But then later on, I became, you know, very much involved in urban housing issues. I've been on various NGO boards. I've chaired a national organisation and all those sorts of things. And I've continued to be an activist, but not as a demonstrator, not, you know, involved in what I'm going to talk about here is underground activities and so on. In a sense, much less visible, but nevertheless what I think is really important because of the levels of inequality in Australian society, the fact that our housing system, as far as I'm concerned, is broken in terms of levels of homelessness, declining levels of housing affordability and so on. All of this continues, and I continue to work on those issues, and I still regard myself as an activist in that sense. So, as I say, there's some academic type language there, a bit of a framework about the way in which I think about the state, and I guess the sort of summary point to make out of that is that it probably takes a bit of getting to know how things are organised, but nevertheless there are ways in and through that. And if I was to pick out one word there, it's a crossroads. It's a point at which we can intersect and connect, and we can. It's often very difficult. Housing policy is something I despair about, but it nevertheless is possible to get in there and to think about the sort of changes that might be made. Okay, so this is really this period, what I call, in a sense, what I call categorical state activism, which is around the Vietnam War and conscription. In a sense, there was no in-between ground. It was simply the point after we'd gone into Vietnam, which is 1964. Sorry, conscription was introduced in 1964. We're in Vietnam by 1965, and we have a flow of soldiers into Vietnam. It was absolutely categorical that we should not be there. The only answer to it was that we should be abolishing conscription and we should be out of Vietnam, and so should the Americans and the Koreans and the Thais and the other nation states that had committed to Vietnam. Very quickly, a bit of background. These are two, he's a colonel at the bottom and he's a general at the top. We had the French were colonialists in Vietnam. They were soundly beaten by General Giap and his forces as nationalist liberation forces in 1954. This was the hapless French colonel who was in that big battle in Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Essentially, the Americans are starting to pick up and to support the French in that latter part of the war, and then continued right through, slowly increasing. I think something like 17,000 military advisors, eventually ramping up to 500,000 troops in Vietnam. Right through the 60s and into the 70s before they finally left in 1975. But in terms of the Australian involvement, we introduced conscription in 1964 under the Menzies government, which was a conservative coalition government that was supporting the Americans in their role in Vietnam and Southeast Asia more generally. And eventually this goes up to 10,000 troops were present in Vietnam at any one time, and conscripts were simply a part of that force. These are the other nation states that were in there with some level of support to the US and to what was then the South Vietnamese Army. Vietnam got divided into North Vietnam and to South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese government was supported, is only there because of American support. So conscription, so the National Service Act required men to register in the 6 months that they turned 20. So I turned 20 in October of 1968. I can't remember the weeks, there was a couple of weeks there that I was meant to register. I didn't. I actually wrote to the Department of Labour and National Service administering the scheme and said that I was not going to register, and that we'd see where it, in a sense, where it would go. The birthdays, they didn't want everyone, so the way they selected was to draw birthdays out of a ballot. And they used the Tats Lotto barrel to do that. And this is actually Lindsay Hassett. If people know cricket history, which I don't, but Hassett was a very important cricket player, and in the 1960s, 1950s, and they took a distinguished citizen to actually draw the birthday marbles from the ballot. Interestingly, Aboriginal men were not required to register. This, of course, conscription starts before we have the constitutional amendment in 1967, which changed the constitution and, in a sense, made Indigenous people Australian citizens, which they had not been until 1967. So conscription predates that, and they weren't required. So there was a provision if you had registered and so on, and then said, but my conscientious beliefs are that I cannot engage in any form of military activity or military service, and you could take that case to a magistrate, the magistrate's court. They would hear this and decide as to whether you had that conscientious belief or not. And many, and I think over 1,000 did during the course of this, the National Service Act before it was abolished in 1972. So if you went through that process, you were conscripted, you'd gone through a medical examination, then you would turn up to an intake point, an induction point, and be conscripted. And I have a picture of one of those coming up. This is it here. Up the top there is the Swan Street Army Barracks with conscripts going in on day one and about to have their hair more or less shaved and put into uniform and begin and get involved in those sort of activities in Vietnam. That's actually a picture of a conscript with a piece of heavy armament blasting away in the South Vietnamese countryside. So that's they're the sort of the rough figures of that we had that number who registered, and then 63,000 called up over that time. 500 died, and a couple of hundred of those were national servicemen. This created a response. When essentially there's two periods that can be, and there's a small literature on this that talks about it in these terms, that where there is a campaign. Essentially, the first period, which is what this is here, is thinking about about how that might change at future elections, and people pinned their hopes on the 1966 election, and which wasn't to be. There's what I call bounded dissent, which grew over those couple of years, where the ALP was sort of opposed to conscription. You had the formation of the youth campaign against conscription, and importantly, Save Our Sons. Save Our Sons was a group of mothers or women. I guess some of them weren't actually mothers of conscripts or young men facing conscription, but nevertheless were a part of that women's part of the movement. A lot of support for conscientious objection, using the provisions of the National Service Act, so within the law. Indeed, at one point I convened a conscientious objectors discussion group, met I think once a month, and worked through the issues. We did this at the Quaker House just somewhere there near Toorak, I think it was. And as I say, coupled to the 1966 election, an attempt to get people to vote on the conscription issue, and to a degree the Vietnam War issue, but it wasn't to be. This is actually, that's me there actually. I think at Caulfield Town Hall, at one of the election rallies, and I think it was a press photo that just happened to be me holding the banner. So 66, there's a a lot of disappointment, but then it's a matter of picking ourselves up, and I guess there's sort of a sense of that. I think I felt the same sort of sense of this when we abolished the carbon tax a few years ago. Sense this major achievement that then simply got unravelled, and look at the mess we're in terms of climate change politics at the moment. So in a sense, regenerating, re-energising and rethinking the way in which the movement ran. So that by this stage, as I said before, I'd written to the Department of Labour and National Service. I called myself a conscientious non-complier. What a mouthful that is. But language is important because it starts to tell you about the way in which things and styles of action get linked to particular ways of talking and writing. So we formed the Draft Resistors Union, the DRU, and so you end up with a network of the Draft Resistors Union, no real national body so much, but state-based, and I guess ultimately based in the capital cities of the states, and begin to become involved in different types of action. So here's one. This is actually me again. It's one of those that I found in the archive yesterday. Burning my draft card. So I hadn't registered. I was therefore automatically called up. I knew this was going to happen. I had not gone to a medical examination. So earlier on, I'd been picked up for that. Indeed, I did 7 days in Pentridge because I wouldn't enter a recognizance to go and have a medical examination for military service. So that's, I think I was at Melbourne University at that point, and you can see I'd grown a sort of a wispy beard by then. And but then the top right-hand one is a sit-in. So this is sitting in the Commonwealth Parliamentary offices, which were near where the Myer shops is in Little Bourke Street. No longer serves that purpose, that building, but under these rather nonplussed police and other officials wondering what to do, but essentially disrupting the operations of parliamentarians and their offices there in Little Bourke Street. And there's the language has changed. Resist the draft, don't register. So, and that in itself is another offence because it's encouraging people to break the law, which was then linked to the Crimes Act. And indeed, the Crimes Act was used or threatened to be used on many occasions for people who made that statement about not registering for national service. So the next point is really important, is that our resistance thinking, eventually we thought initially that, yep, you get picked up and you go to jail and, you know, the sentence was equivalent to the length of national service, which was 2 years, or they then reduced it to 18 months. But we then began to rethink that and to say, well, the penalties are illegitimate. We use this word legitimacy and illegitimate as a part of the language so enforcing those penalties was illegitimate as the Act itself. So that we, within this context, we're building the coalitions that are part of that process, and a big focus was the 3 moratorium demonstrations. So this is really just a summary of the sort of civil disobedience that became a part of a mass movement. And as best I can tell, the photograph I've picked here is actually people sitting down in the streets of Melbourne, which was a very radical step back in 1970, that you would actually have a sort of a mass civil disobedience process. We ran Don't Register campaigns, so encouraging people to do, what I and a growing number of people have done. Raids on national service offices. I remember one here in Swanston Street. There was a Department of Labor National Service, and I don't think I was actually involved directly in that one, but people went into the offices and simply took files out and tipped them out the window. So it was not attacking people personally, but destroying, in a sense, the infrastructure of this process. We established an underground, and what that simply means is, for me, I was a part of that process. I lived with a variety of people, professor of history at Monash, a businessman, superintendent, psychiatrist, and so on, just to give you an idea. And essentially, the middle classes of around were linked in and provided accommodation and sustenance to draft resistors, and we'd continue to pop up. So we'd give a press conference, we'd appear at something and then disappear, and so on. So it was a sort of a cat and mouse type game, and there were a few casualties, people who did get caught and did end up in jail. And then I guess a very big one was one at Melbourne University in 1970, if I've got the date right, September 70, where we actually set up a draft sanctuary at Melbourne University. We were there for about 3 or 4 nights and days, and with thousands of people around providing support. And what's really interesting now that community radio is really a part of the scene. There was no community radio at the time. One of our network, an enterprising person, actually built a radio transmitter. We put a tower up on the roof of Melbourne University Student Union and broadcast. We called it 3DRU, 3 Draft Resistors Union. And it broadcast about 6 or 8 kilometres around the centre of Melbourne. And as I sit-ins, in offices outside of army bases. I remember sitting in one outside Holsworthy in New South Wales. Just a couple of pictures from the Moratorium March, the button and one of the marches. Okay, so then where's all this going? And it had been a pretty despondent history, in my view, for a very long period of time. 1949 to 1972, a Conservative government. Which doesn't mean to say it didn't have any achievements I'd agree with, but it did. It was a Conservative government to its core. Between 66 and 69, the mood shifted. And in a way, it shifts and it accommodates, in some respects, the sort of processes, the political processes of the moratorium movement, draft resistance, a whole lot of other things going on. The advent of the second wave of feminism has become apparent, and it's a part of the process. There's growing environmental action. So all of this, in a sense, the aspirations of much of this then gets picked up in the electoral processes, and particularly the reformation of Labor Party policy during that period, and a new leader, which is Gough Whitlam, and it's a resounding victory for Whitlam in 1972, December 1972, there at the end, and the absolute commitment. And people remark, and it's been written up in literature, that in the election campaigns that in the big sort of meetings that led into that election victory, when Whitlam made the commitment to withdraw troops from Vietnam, to abolish conscription, that was the commitment that got the loudest cheer at these very big rallies. That one of them was just over the road here in the city square. And certainly the opinion polls had shifted massively, so that there was a very clear majority of Australian citizens who were very clear that we should not be in Vietnam, there should be no conscription. So the government comes in. And that's the slogan that was so central to the campaign. It's time, and there's a whole. You can actually find this stuff on YouTube these days. The way in which, in a sense, the advertising and communication industry got in behind this campaign, and a lot of leaders of the film industry and from television and so on became a part of this. So there's a very remarkable, and I'm no good at singing, so I won't try. But there's a song that goes with this. It's time. That's there on YouTube if people want to go back and look it up. But so immediately, what happens the next day is that as the incoming Prime Minister, indeed for the first 2 weeks, there was such a job of reorganising things that Whitlam and Lance Barnard, the Deputy Prime Minister, formed the whole cabinet. They were called the duumvirate. They simply made a whole range of decisions very quickly that were clearly a part of Labor policy, the incoming government, before they had time to sort out the cabinet, they made decisions, and a couple of those decisions was to abolish conscription. Not only that, to say to the conscripts, if you want to leave, you can. You can leave the army. And to start immediately to take troops out of Vietnam, and to let the draft resistors that were in jail out of jail. So that, and a big shift in foreign policy at the time. Indeed, the Australian government at that time is the first government of all Western nations, I think this is right, certainly well ahead of the Americans, recognised China Whitlam, one of the first things he does, gets on a plane, goes to China, and there's a process of recognising China diplomatically. So some very big shifts, and the abolition of conscription and withdrawal from Vietnam is a change in foreign policy is a part of that change. And I guess this, just to sort of contrast it with, I guess, where I'm at now, what I might call sort of everyday activism, where we think I'm always involved in thinking about change along a scale which is sort of really tough, really hard. For instance, I'm going to a meeting on Saturday morning around housing policy, which, and I won't repeat what I said before about the sort of circumstances that we face in urban Australia and our housing system, which is essentially a rampaging market. So these are the sort of arrangements that I'm now very familiar with. The Australian federal state, the civil society type organisations that you've got to work across to be able to do. To be able to think and work through as to what some of those changes might be. I'm not going to stop and sort of work my way through that list, but that's the sort of outside of government, inside of government, the way in which you think about all of that coming together. And what I'd point out is that there's limited mobilisations of welfare and state consumers and clients and all that. If I look around for an organisation of tenants and people who are dispossessed within our Australian housing market, I can't find it. It's simply not there. There's been attempts, and indeed you can find some little local groups sometimes of public housing tenants who are trying to do something about perhaps ageing public housing stock and so on. But you won't find people marching down the street saying fairness in the housing system. Essentially what we've got, professionals and researchers like me, people who work in the system as crisis accommodation workers and so on. And that's who will be at the meeting on Saturday morning. Okay, people are actually employed providing services that are steamed up about all this and think that change needs to happen. And but at the same time, I was talking to Olivia about this, that's really important to recognise, and what I noticed, the change over time. I talked about social movements during the 60s and the 70s. They've had an influence. What government does, the way it talks about things, the sorts of programs and policies that it has are things that you would not have thought about or imagined or hoped for back in the 1960s. So that the influence of the women Indigenous disability service systems policies is absolutely a part of the furniture now in ways that weren't some decades ago. And all I'm doing there is, this is just a little illustration I took out of a research report of mine a couple of years ago, which gives you, in a sense, the sort of messiness of trying to work through some change. And this was a report around rooming houses. Now, these people who live in rooming houses in the Australian urban context are the poorest of the poor, disadvantaged, often mental illness and disability and all the other sort of things that go with it. And, essentially, I'm working down there in that bottom right-hand corner there as part of the advocacy process, as a researcher sort of feeding things in to try and get change. And look at the mess of bits of government that get involved in things called rooming houses, which is really what we're trying to do to change things. It's a long, slow, everyday process, which is quite different to, I guess, what I was doing in my late teens and early 20s in that what I call categorical campaigning. Activism to stop being involved in war, stop sending young men to war.